So last night was a very good night to be an IndyCar fan and a very bad night to be an Indianapolis Colts fan. But I've taken a break from my pursuit of a Jacoby Brissett jersey and crying myself to sleep to talk about what was an absolutely bangin' IndyCar race at World Wide Technologies Raceway. But to normal people, it was at Gateway. And it was just probably going to end up, we've got two races to go, and Portland was the best race last year, so there's a possibility it could get knocked off of this pedestal, but I thought start to finish the most entertaining race of this season and probably the best race of this season. Just from a perspective of entertainment, I don't think you can get much better than that. So let's begin right at the start of the race, and our heroic drivers picked up right where they left off at Pocono, going four wide into turn one on lap one. And I would like to point out something because Takuma Sato got bounced around quite a bit, and boy, oh boy, was he the center of controversy this week. But the five cars all together going into turn one were the exact five cars and drivers that were involved in that massive lap one crash at Pocono just a week ago. I could not, but you couldn't have scripted it any better. And all those drivers ended up in that position. And at least this week they didn't crash. But it was funny and ironic nonetheless to see that. So really this weekend, I think if you would have looked at it prior to the race, I know because I asked on social media, a lot of people were like, all right, this is Joseph Newgarden and Penske's week. But it was apparent very quickly that Santino Ferrucci in particular, but the whole Dale Coyne Racing team was very strong. And the early part of this race was really just the two Penske cars of Power, who was the winner at Pocono, and Newgarden, who's just had been the dominant car all week. And then Santino Ferrucci had come up from the third or fourth row, was fourth place very early on, and then just was continuing to hammer away at the two Penske cars. And those three cars really got a pretty significant lead right before the first pit stop. And that's where we saw Will Power make a pretty big mistake. He had talked all week about cleaning off the second groove, and ended up getting up into the wall on an outlap coming out of the pits, sticking it in the wall and ending his day, really going from zero to hero from Pocono, where he was able to get his 13th consecutive year with a race win at that race, albeit rain shortened, though, like I told you last week, I think Power was the guy who was going to win that race regardless of whether or not it went 500 miles. And that's kind of going to be a theme, the whole zero to hero thing, except for the guy we're going to be talking about what much later in this video went from hero or zero to hero rather than hero to zero like Power did. But this was something that I think really needed to be addressed as well, talking about Power and the second groove. And it's kind of frustrating because the rest of the race was so good, but definitely, in the middle of the green flag stints, it definitely spread out to the point where nobody was able to pass anybody. And ultimately that comes down to the fact that there was pretty high tire degradation, a lot of marbles, especially accumulating in what would have been the second groove. I don't really understand how or why a tire is brought to the track in a spec tire series on a flat 1 mile oval that degrades that much. And I have praised Firestone quite a bit this year in particular for bringing high deg tires or a big performance gap between red and black tires on the road courses because it spiced up the show there. But unfortunately, when you bring a tire that's that I don't want to say anything derogatory because I know that they weren't building unsafe tires, but they were building tires that were causing a lot of rubber buildup around the racetrack, and it was detrimental to the race. And again, spec tire series, I don't really understand why that's happening. The philosophy really shouldn't be we need tires with high degradation in an oval, because ultimately it ends up hurting the show. People aren't able to pass. Like we saw later in the race, people were getting up into the wall. I mean, Joseph Newgarden nearly threw away his championship the same way Will Power did earlier in the race. And then, of course, we saw at the very end of the race, guys like Santino Ferrucci were trying to make that second groove work to make some passes to try a challenge for the win, and just couldn't do it. I mean, it was an ice skating rink up there. So I would hope, and the next time they get to a short oval, Firestone will bring either a harder or more durable compound, whatever they need to do to kind of mitigate that problem. Now, because of this second groove not really coming in very much, and every time yellow came out, IndyCar needed to take a 20-lap caution to sweep it, the advantage of that was the restarts were absolutely wild. We saw guys making huge three-wide moves, sliding around, dive bombing each other into the corners. Really exciting stuff. And because of that Will Power yellow and how the timing kind of worked out, the lead actually went to James Hinchcliffe, but it was Santino Ferrucci who was able to leapfrog Newgarden in the pit sequence, who really was hounding Hinch quite a bit, was able to pass Hinch, take the lead, and led the race for 100 laps. And I have to tell you, I mean, Santino Ferrucci's development on the oval tracks this season has been absolutely spectacular. You think about where he was at Indianapolis and where he finished that race, in Texas, where both races, admittedly, I think he ran fairly conservatively. He wasn't really mixing it up too much, but guess what? He finished both races, and both races well up in the top 10. Then you start getting to Iowa, and you start to see some of that aggression building up. Pocono, again, a lot of aggression going for the front. And then you get to Gateway, and suddenly the guy's looking like a race winner. And, had the yellows not fallen a certain way, he probably would have absolutely romped to a victory. It's pretty amazing. And I have to tell you, it's not all Santino. There is certainly Michael Cannon with his influence on that team, the engineering, and Pancho Carter. I'm going to be honest with you. If you're McLaren, you're Zach Brown, and you are looking at bringing Santino Ferrucci in, I would look at poaching Michael Cannon and maybe Pancho Carter as well. You go out and get those guys as well, pay them, bring them into the team. Because I think Santino is very talented, but I think he does need a support group around him that's going to be able to elevate him and keep him focused. And I think the group that's around him right now is absolutely getting the maximum performance out of Santino Ferrucci. And I guess for Dale Coyne's sake, I hope Zach Brown does not listen to my advice and doesn't hire any of them away, because it was really cool to see Dale Coyne Racing dominate this race. I mean, at one point it was Bourdais and Ferrucci up front 1-2, and it looked like they weren't going to be touched, and they're beating Penske at an oval track, and no one has done that this year, not even Alexander Rossi at the Indy 500. So putting it into those terms and into that perspective, that was pretty spectacular. In fact, this whole race was just a lot of different names running up at the front, and just the general unpredictability was absolutely fantastic. But the Dale Coyne fairy tale unfortunately fell apart, at least for Sebastian Bourdais, after a round of pit stops very similar to what we'd seen with Newgarden and Power earlier in the race. Gets up into the marbles, gets into the wall, and somehow does not get collected by his teammate Santino Ferrucci. Again, Santino using the throttle to get through a wreck. But this was the major turning point in the race, because it happened right on the edge of where everybody could make a stop and make it to the end of the race. So some drivers were thinking about saving fuel at the end. Other drivers were making a pit stop to top off and make it to the end, no problem. And because of the way it all worked out, and some of IndyCar's wacky caution procedures, the top three ended up being Takuma Sato, Tony Kanaan, and Ed Carpenter. And this just blew my mind. I mean, it was unbelievable to see those three up front, and considering how hard passing had been in the past, and the fact that these three drivers, along with Newgarden, who had cycled around to fourth, had fresh tires, they had a distinct advantage. And in that, it didn't look like they were going to be the ones that were going to be very easily passed. And when we get to the restart, Takuma Sato pulls away and looks like he's going to be gone. Then it's Tony Kanaan and Ed Carpenter, who are doing battle for second. Joseph Newgarden was, I think, pretty content to sit in fourth because Alexander Rossi, who was not having a fantastic day, though at one point he'd worked his way up to third, had to pit for fuel. Then you get Santino Ferrucci, who was charging through the field. He was able to get around Joseph Newgarden, and then he tried for a couple of laps to get around Ed Carpenter, and we saw that second groove just not working. Almost lost the car, almost got into the wall, actually got passed by Newgarden. And then it became a duel for second between Ed and Tony Kanaan, and Ed was able to get around TK, and then suddenly Ed's right on the back of Takuma Sato, and it's just like, what is happening? And so with 2 laps to go, Ed is right on the rear wing of Takuma. He hounds him. He gets there in turn 3, almost able to pass him by the line, but Takuma Sato wins the race, but we're not even done yet. We're not even close to done yet, because suddenly in the background, Joseph Newgarden is spinning a la Mid-Ohio, and we later find out that because Tony Kanaan blocked the absolute bejesus out of Santino Ferrucci on the back straightaway, that put Ferrucci up into the marbles, and then which Ferrucci turned straight down across the track into Newgarden's path, and Newgarden went skidding across the curbing, somehow managed to not hit the wall. There is so much to talk about this race. Okay. Oh, by the way, it was also the closest finish in Gateway history. Not really a surprise, but it's the first time we've seen cars side-by-side at the finish of a race in quite a while. I can't even remember the last time we saw cars side-by-side when the checkered flag flew. So Takuma Sato taking the win. What a contrast. I mean, even people like me were absolutely lighting up Takuma on social media. I feel bad about that in retrospect, but, emotions were very high, like I've mentioned in previous videos about Pocono, and I think a lot of people said things they probably would regret later on. But Takuma, being the guy he is, was a class act early on when he was interviewed. He thanked the fans for the support and then went out there and won the race. I mean, you can't get much better in terms of a redemption arc, we'll use that phrase, than to go from the lowest of lows at Pocono, where people are, advocating for you to get suspended or thrown out of the sport or whatever, to winning a race. And honestly, Takuma Sato, in all his wins, he's won 5 races, I think, at this point. He hasn't won a boring one yet, which is fascinating to think about. But yeah, that's fantastic. And now he's going into another race weekend, Portland last year, where he got a win in very similar circumstances. He's going to be riding a lot of confidence going into the last couple of races. We get to second place, Ed Carpenter, out of nowhere. I mean, he's always been the Ovalmeister, but the fact that he hasn't really had a great car under him for a lot of the time outside of Indianapolis, and even then he really wasn't a factor to win that race. To get second, and to be honest with you, had he passed Tony Kanaan about 1 lap earlier, I think he would have gotten Sato. It definitely looked like he had the strongest car of the drivers who were in that top 3, outside of Santino Ferrucci, who we'll talk about here in just a second. Tony Kanaan getting third. It was a pretty big-time block on Santucci on the last lap, but I think Tony Kanaan really needed this. And, there's kind of something that I kind of abide by in racing is that if on a start you go forward, but then as the cars kind of spread out, you go backwards, it's a car problem. I think Tony Kanaan is not a bad driver, or he's not lost it. I think, as some people have suggested, I think the Foyt cars are just not that great. Look at where Matheus Leist is compared to Tony Kanaan most weeks, and I think you'll see that. So I think Tony Kanaan has still got it. It's just unfortunate that the Foyt car just wasn't good enough for him to challenge for the win. I mean, ultimately, that's what it comes down to. The strategy, the team put him right where he needed to be. The car just wasn't good enough, and he managed to salvage third, which I think is a huge boost to that team. And apparently it was the first time since Kansas of 2002 that a Foyt car got on a podium at an oval, believe it or not. Fourth place was Santino Ferrucci, and I've already said enough about Santino Ferrucci that's positive. Let's talk some negative. The chop on Newgarden at the end, I think Joseph was well within his rights to be upset with him and sit him down and talk to him like the champion that he is, trying to say, look, you can't do that on an oval. Completely agree, way over the line. But at the same time, he drove a fantastic race. And like I said, his development on these ovals has been absolutely stellar. And he may end up being the Rookie of the Year at the end of the day. And who would have believed that after Colton Herta was able to pull off a pretty dominant-looking win at Circuit of the Americas earlier this year. And then think about what Felix Rosenqvist has done. And even despite the fact that he crashed twice, Marcus Ericsson has done a great job. Simon Pagenaud, haven't talked much about him, but he had a pretty solid day, especially considering that he was the first to cross the line out of the Penske cars. Again, it looked like he was a victim of traffic. He got back in the traffic, and somehow he drove up to fifth, despite the fact that second groove really wasn't a big deal. So that should tell you something about his day. Connor Daly, man. Somebody give this guy a full-time ride. I'm sorry. At this point, I believe the meme. Connor is for real. He had a Carlin car legitimately third, legitimately fighting with the Penske cars, legitimately fighting with the Dale Coyne cars. I don't know what else to say. Give him a ride. That's all I can say. Newgarden, man, not of his doing. He drove a really smart race, but he ends up seventh after taking the white flag in fourth. It is what it is with Santino. He's still got a big margin over Rossi. And the fact, I haven't even talked about this yet, the fact that Dixon fell out of the race with a mechanical failure of all things, that was crazy, because now Pagenaud moves into second at the points. Rossi, despite finishing, I think, 13th, one lap down, only lost like 4 points going into the last couple of races, which again, I think you would probably look at the natural terrain road courses favoring Rossi. Having this big of a gap, especially to Pagenaud, who we know Newgarden has beat in the past for a championship, I still lean towards it being a Newgarden versus Rossi battle for the championship. Pagenaud being up there, though, that's definitely something that I think we need to watch out for after the summer break. Once he finally got a break after the Indy 500, he's just been on it. So yeah, I think it's a 3-horse race now. I think Dixon's pretty well on the outside of it. Ryan Hunter-Reay was pretty quiet, all things considered, outside of a little bit of contact with Takuma Sato on the start. Not much to say. We know that Hunter-Reay usually comes on pretty strongly in the last couple of races. He won Sonoma last year. I don't know if many people even remember that, but he did. So maybe he'll be just as strong at Laguna Seca. He's one of a few drivers, not even a few, probably a few drivers, 3 of them, that actually have experience at Laguna Seca in an IndyCar. So that'll be something to watch out for. Colton Herta getting 9th. He was exciting on the restarts. Second of the Andretti affiliated cars, kept it off the wall. I think that's an important step for him, considering how much he's hit the walls in recent oval races. And the Andretti cars, who are all 8, 9, and 10. It just didn't look like they had the setup this week. If they had, they probably would have dominated the race. But it is what it is. And then 10th place, Marco Andretti. What else to say? Marco got 10th. It was cool to see Oberto Beef Jerky on that car. I wish there were bigger sponsors all the time for all these drivers, but considering the crowd that Gateway was able to bring in, it's cool to see mainstream-ish sponsors on cars like Marco, and Marco delivered with the top 10. It wasn't super spectacular, but again, he was there, and you weren't, I suppose. So, all right, Gateway. I think I've talked about absolutely everything. There were a couple of iffy blocking calls. I definitely would have given one to Hinchcliffe. I don't know if people will get mad at me for that, but it is what it is. Going on to Portland, we know that was probably the best race of last year. Hopefully there won't be a gigantic crash on the first lap this year like there was last year, but you never know. Takuma Sato will look pretty strong, I think, once again. But the championship battle is really going to be the thing to watch out for. Will Newgarden be able to extend his lead, or is it going to be a Pagenaud or a Rossi really being able to go out and dominate the race like we know they are capable of doing? And then Laguna Seca is a total crapshoot because nobody has any setup notes for that track. So it could turn out that Santino Ferrucci hits the setup like he did at Gateway this time and just leads all the laps because there won't be any crazy BS IndyCar yellows. Who knows? It's going to be fun to talk about. I'll just put it that way going into the end of the season. Thank you guys so much for watching. This has been David Land on YouTube, and I will see you in the next video.